Welcome to Generations, a show for seniors, people who know seniors, or people who someday are going to become seniors. I'm David Lepaco, and I will be your host for this episode of Generations. And today I think we have certainly a generations appropriate theme involving the issue of wills and trusts. And if you think about it, as you get older, you have some money, you have some real estate, you have various possessions, and somehow the world has to know what you would like your descendants to do with all those possessions. And it's not always a fun topic to address. It's a hard one to address in some ways, but hopefully we can provide some insights into how you deal with estate planning. And we have a special guest who I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, our regular co-hosts, I asked each of them if they would be willing to share whether they currently have a will or a trust. And Candy Pettiford, you're first up. How are you today? And do you have any wills or trusts?
Oh, great being here, David. I'm glad the sun's out, and yes, and I do have a will, yes, and I'm glad I did because my husband passed in July, so I'm glad we already did that.
Well, good. I'm glad that you got that done. There's a
Yes.
real value to that, a real relief to it. Thank
Very
you, Candy. Rashida Jenkins is next. And Rashida, have you done any definite estate planning in terms of wills and trusts?
Dave, thank you. Great to be here. I do not have a will or a trust, so I'm going to be listening intently and taking notes because I need to get prepared. So thank you.
Okay. And finally, Nadia Giordana is with us. And Nadia, how are you doing? And do you have a will or a trust?
I'm doing great. And yes, I do have a will. It's my second, and it is 10 years old, and it feels like it's out of date. It's better than nothing. It's better than nothing, but I need to update it yet this winter.
Okay, well, boy, have I got a gift for you. We have someone today who is our featured guest who can hopefully give us some insights about that. And her name is Dana Holt. And Dana is the head of Holt Consulting. You may see a connection there. And she began her career as an estate planning attorney. She spent 13 years at a Fortune 300 financial services company where she helped advisors all over the US with their most complex cases and taught them how to integrate charitable planning as into their practice, which is something that any one of us could do as well. She's a graduate of Mitchell Hamlin Law School, Southern Illinois University. She's been quoted in Forbes magazine and a featured writer for Thomson Reuters Estate Planning Journal. She served as the chair of the Minnesota Gift Planning Association in 2020 and 2021. And so, Dana Holt, a warm welcome, a warm generations welcome to you. Tell us a little bit about what you do, what we might want to know at the outset here about both wills and trusts.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of your show today. This is just an honor. And yes, I am the owner and sole proprietor of Holt Consulting, and I started my career as an estate planning attorney, like you said, and I thought that's what I was going to do my whole law career. And then I discovered charitable gift planning and fell in love with that. So as you know, my background is in law and financial services, but today, for the last 7 years, I have been operating a consulting firm that focuses mainly on working with nonprofits around the area of non-cash giving and helping nonprofits to be able to accept things like real estate or farm machinery or cryptocurrency or any of those things that we have. And the reason it's so important is less than 10% of our wealth is held in cash. So yes, so if charities are really going to give their donors the opportunity to support them in a big way, they have to be prepared to accept these more complex gifts. And so that kind of leads us into the estate planning conversation, I think, because we think about our assets, it's not really in cash, it's in stuff, it's in real estate, it's in retirement accounts, it's in other things. If you run a business, it might be your small business or even a big business, stocks, stuff like that, and figuring out how that's going to transition to the next generation, to your favorite charities when you've passed from this world. It's a big decision, but it's an important thing to think about and put that plan in place.
Well, if you had someone like Rashida who says, I haven't done this yet, what's your most convincing arguments you can make to her that would motivate her to want to move to the next step of actually making that happen?
Well, as I often say to people, you don't create an estate plan for yourself. You create it for those who are still here living when you pass away, because it's going to be up to them to take your stuff and transition it. Like I say, dead people can't own stuff. It's just not allowed. And so that's what, estate administration is about. It's about taking things that belong to the deceased person and moving them along to living people and their favorite charitable organizations. And, the more in order you have things when your time comes, it's going to be much easier for your family or your friends or whoever's in charge of taking care of that. They're going to be grieving you. And so to give them the gift of an orderly estate plan, they know where it is, they know what you have, how to access it, then that transition can happen much faster. And then also the more orderly your plan is, then your assets will be transferred quicker. You won't have, a lot of court administered rigmarole to try and define where that goes. Because if you don't have a plan, the state has a plan for you, and they'll dole out your assets the way that the law states, and it may not be the way you want. And then, beyond your assets, it's also about those you're responsible for. So if you have children, you're going to want to think about, okay, if they're minors when I pass, I need to think about guardians. I need to think about providing, income or assets to take care of those children. If you've got children with special needs, or even grandchildren with special needs that have, government benefits, you want to make sure that, the assets you give them don't jeopardize those government benefits. So there's a lot that goes into it, and it's really personalized. And I will say, estate planning attorneys who help with this sort of thing, they really care about people. They're just very caring people by nature. They go into this because it's kind of a calling. And so they help walk you through those things and, think about stuff you may not have thought about before.
Mhm. I guess the
I
big thing is you don't do this really for yourself. You're
Mhm.
doing it for your loved ones so that they're not in turmoil, confusion, and chaos trying to figure out what to do. So you're doing it for them. Nadia, did you have something you wanted to add?
I did. I was wondering about, I'm assuming that if someone were to be really wealthy, they use lawyers and things like that to execute a super complicated will. But for the average person like me, what would be, because I have found it difficult, what would be the criteria for finding a suitable executor for a modest estate?
So when you say executor, that's the person who's going to take care of your wealth, moving it from one place to the next. And it can be a family member if you think your family member can handle that, if they're good at managing details, that might be an okay job for them. Or maybe you want to nominate a bank or a trust company to do that for you if you do not have someone in your life that you think either would be willing or able to handle that. And like I said, the simpler you can make things for people, the less expensive it's going to be on the administration side. If you don't have a plan, that's when the administration becomes more expensive. So you can actually save money on the administration side if you have a nice, clear plan put in place to begin with.
So when you're saying administration plan, are you saying you're going to need a lawyer? Is that what you're saying?
Well, you don't necessarily, usually lawyers aren't the ones who are going to actually be the executor. They will serve to represent the executor. So let's take an example here. Let's say when my time comes, I've nominated a friend to be the executor of my estate, but that person will need to have legal guidance. And so they'll probably work with the attorney who drafted my plan to then get guidance as to how they should do that. But usually it's not the lawyer that does it. It can be a conflict of interest for the lawyer to actually be your executor. So you can nominate a person, a family member or a friend to be your executor. Sometimes they're called a personal representative as well, just different terminology, but they'll probably work with an attorney for legal guidance to take them through it, especially if you're going through probate, which is a court process. They're going to need an attorney to, serve as that attorney in court. So you will definitely need a lawyer to draft it, but then when the time comes after you've passed away, you don't have to have you probably won't have a lawyer to actually be the executor, but you'll need one to help provide guidance to that individual that you do nominate.
Mm-hmm. Dana, at a more granular level, how specific do some of these wills have to be? I'm thinking of a family I know where there was a lot of bad feelings, a lot of hurt feelings out of who gets the silverware from the buffet. And symbolically, getting the silverware meant that I'm special and loved. Not getting the silverware meant that I'm being slighted and hurt. How specific do these agreements have to be? What would be some things specifically that people might not think about that ought to be part of these arrangements?
That's a really good question. Usually when I'm thinking about these things, I'm thinking about the big things like the retirement assets and the real estate and stuff like that, not thinking about the silver or the, the dining table or the piano, but those are kind of the sentimental things. So I think if you know that a certain family member has a sentimental value attached to that asset, then maybe you do want to make specific provisions to say the piano goes to Brian and the silverware goes to Chuck or whatever that is, and really think about those sentimental things. I know my parents asked me, or my dad asked me, he had, a few pieces of furniture that were important to him. And he said, I was planning on giving this to you. Is this something you want? And I said, Dad, I do not want that 80-year-old roll top desk.
Oh,
No, that thing's creaky. You can't open it. Thanks, but no thanks. But then there might be, I said, no, but I'll really take your record collection, because I remember as a little kid, we would sit in front of the record player when I was, 3 or 4 years old and listen to music. And he never even considered that. So really open communication, I think, is more important than getting, super granular in your plan, but you just want to make sure that you talk to your family ahead of time. What is important to you? What are kind of those sentimental, personal possessions of mine that would be meaningful to you?
Yeah. On the plus side, I'm still thinking of my grandpa Joe, who he lived on Grand Avenue in St. Paul. I used to spend a lot of time over there, and I always used to mow the lawn on the property. And I didn't think anything of it. But then after he passed, there in his will, all the grandchildren got a fraction of his estate. I'll say like 1/16 of his estate. But David, me, for having mowed his lawn all those years, he gave me an additional 1/32 of his estate. But it was so sweet that he thought of me and the fact that I had mowed his lawn all those years. So it was a very nice parting gift that I've always remembered and always sort of cherished.
oh yes. Oh,
I have a question. So, thinking about the will that I don't have currently, and I
Mhm.
will work on it. If I draft it myself, let's say, because like Nadia said, I'm not a millionaire, and so a lot of my things may be more sentimental than having a cash value, if that makes sense. And let's say,
Mhm.
when I pass away, it'll be my husband who will be the executor. Now, he's going through grief, he's having a tough time with his loss. Who holds him accountable to what I have put in that will to make sure that it's allocated to whom I've allocated the my belongings to?
The probate court does. So, you hear the word probate, you're wondering what is that? And you hear kind of people say, "Ooh, you want to avoid probate." What is it? Well, it's just the court administered or court supervised process
Mhm.
to transfer or make sure that the executor is transferring assets in the way that your will says, and they hold them accountable. And so there's a court process. Usually there's not a lot of appearances in court, but it's more of an administrative role that the court plays to make sure that that is taken care of properly.
So someone would have to complain, in other words.
Well, and the question is who would complain? Who
Right.
are your heirs? But really, when someone passes away with a will, their will is then entered into the probate court. They get a copy of the will. You have to notify creditors in case there's, debts that need to be collected, and there's a certain period of time you have to wait. And then you have to provide an inventory to all the heirs to say, okay, here's what the estate looked like. This is what you're entitled to. And then they'll go through the process of maybe liquidating those assets and sending them cash or giving them actual personal property. So it's the court is going to take that person through those specific steps.
Oh, that's good to know.
and I
Thanks.
have a quick piggyback on what Rashida said. And let's say it's just a husband and wife, like you're talking about, Rashida, and uh, for my mother and father when they had it set up so that and my father passed first, so everything just went to my mother.
Mhm.
And that was the end of the deal for the time being until she should pass and her will would take over. Uh, we never did go to any kind of court or anything to transfer that. Was that okay, or did we miss a step?
You may not have needed to in case if your parents had their assets placed in trust, if your assets, if you know, a trust is a legal entity and people use trust for a lot of different things. I say to people, there's many different types of trusts as there are fish in the sea. It's basically just a way for the trust, which is a legal entity, to hold assets, and you have a trustee, you've nominated someone as the trustee who's responsible for taking care of that. And then once you pass away, it's the trustee's responsibility to, transfer those assets. And it doesn't go through probate because it's held in a trust. And so that would avoid probate. And, trusts give you the ability to do different things, dole out money over time, make sure people don't get a big lump sum, especially if you've got, minor children or people with substance abuse issues. Maybe you don't want to do that. And so maybe your attorney would recommend, let's use a trust. And so maybe that's what your parents had used and didn't have to go through the probate process. And a lot of attorneys will help you create trust to avoid that probate process, because probate is also public. So anybody can go into the public records, go into the probate court and, see your probated documents.
So what got you interested in this, Dana? I mean, what made you start thinking about this? Because you look kind of young to me.
Well, as I tell people sometimes, especially over Zoom, I'm actually older than I look. So
Okay. All right.
I graduated law school in 2003,
Okay.
and so I've been kind of working in this area since then. But it's I guess kind of nerdily, it's the tax side of things and it's sort of the rules. I love kind of putting things in order and taking things through a process and looking at that. And so a lot of estate planning has to do with specific rules, processes, tax law, and that was kind of an attractive thing to me. And also when you like working in the law, you may not want to be a litigator. I mean, that's a real high stress law career. And, estate planning kind of gives you a more relaxed way to, approach the law and work in the law, because there's not a lot of emergencies and, litigation in estate planning. There is some, but not much. So it's kind of nice for me with the way that my brain works, I suppose.
Okay.
And also really helping people with these kind of issues. It's tough stuff, and to kind of put people's minds at ease to say, oh, okay, I've got that done and it wasn't as bad as I thought.
So then they hire you. Is that what you're saying? They hire you?
They did back when I was a practicing, estate planning attorney. My business is different these days, but yeah.
So Dana, apparently there are places you can go online to execute a will, and I don't know how much they cost, but by the same token, I don't know how much an attorney would cost. What kind of money are we really talking about here in either case? Ballpark.
Yeah, I mean, there are some places online where you can draft a will for free. A lot of charities that I work with, they now have services on their websites where you can go and draft a will for free, kind of an online thing. You put in some questions, kind of like using TurboTax. You just answer some questions and it spits out a will for you. So it can be anywhere from free to a few $100s, probably, with those online will makers. But as with a lot of things, like Nadia said, something is better than nothing. Having something in place is better than nothing, but you do kind of get what you pay for. And so if you want more personalized service, to somebody to walk you through things like guardianship for your children, maybe a trust that will dole money out over time, other kinds of things, you're probably not going to get that. You're definitely not going to get that with a will maker. You also want to think about things. Estate planning goes beyond wills and trusts. You think about your medical directive, how you want to be treated in the case where you're, in a coma or something happens to you medically and you can't make decisions for yourself anymore. Who are you going to appoint to do that? What kind of medical intervention or extra steps do you want to be on life support? That's another piece of the estate planning process, is your medical directive. And you don't want your family to have to make decisions on the fly. You want them to have something in place that says, I know what mom or dad wanted. I know what my sister wanted, whatever it happens to be. So that's another piece of it. And, depending on, the online service you're using, you may or may not get all the pieces that you want. And you're not going to have somebody to ask those questions to and have those kind of complicated conversations. And I think, it's really, really worth it to sit down with a human being and have a human conversation about what you want. But at the same time, something's better than nothing. So getting something in place, doing something like that. Working with an attorney, you may spend a few $100s if you have a very simple estate. You may spend a few $1,000s if it's more complex. But it's really going to be driven by the complexity of your estate. And the other thing is, if you go online and do an online will, you may think, okay, everything's taken care of. That doesn't apply to all your assets. If you have retirement assets, if you have life insurance, if you have other financial accounts, those are not affected by any will that you draft. You have to have, beneficiary designations on each of those accounts. So usually when you open up an account, it'll have, on the application, it'll say, well, who's your beneficiary, and you can write that person or persons in there. So sitting down with a human and making sure that you've got all your I's dotted and all your T's crossed is really worth it, I think.
I have a question. Very off the tail of what you just said about beneficiaries being transferred out of like some of your financial accounts. That can be done, correct me if I'm wrong, that can be done also to transfer a house directly upon your demise so that doesn't have to go through probate. Is that correct?
You are correct. Most states in the US now recognize something called a transfer on death deed, or we call it a TOD, a TODD in the industry, more lingo, the TOD. But a transfer on death deed really just allows you to sort of write a beneficiary for your home or your vacation property if you've got a cabin or something like that, because you don't want it to go through probate. Oftentimes, people who pass away, the only probatable asset they have is their home. And so opening up a whole probate, administration with the court for one asset, sometimes, it's overkill. And so that's why these were created. And they're revocable. So if you change your mind, you can change your mind, but you can record that special kind of deed with the county that says, when I pass away, I just want my home to go to, this individual or this charity. In fact, I just worked on a really fun gift of a home by transfer on death deed from a couple in St. Paul. So yes, that is something that can be done. And most states in America do recognize that these days.
Does that also transfer the debt of the home as well?
So that's a really good question. So it's not going to transfer the debt. So any debt you have on your property would then have to be paid out of, either that house would have to be sold before it could be transferred. So if there's a mortgage on the property, the bank's going to have first say on that. And so either the estate has to pay that off before the house can transfer, or the bank will then take it, sell it, to pay off that mortgage. So yeah, there's more nuance that goes into it if there's debt. That's a really good question.
Now, also, like in the movies, you see, the whole, they calling all the family in and everything and whatever. Is that truly what kind of really happens? You call
You're talking about,
the
reading of the will where everybody sits around
and everybody sitting around. You know how they show that in the movies or whatever.
People don't do that. Usually you're notified by mail. You get a letter from the estate attorney and they give you the inventory. This is what's in the estate, and here's that. This is what you're entitled to. So usually you'll be notified by mail. Maybe some people still do a reading of the will, but really that's just for TV and movies.
Yeah, I thought, is that really real? Or
Well, it all sounds quite overwhelming. I suppose what you have to tell yourself is how you will feel once you do this and have it behind you, because at a certain point, it just was going to nag away at you. And the feeling of liberation you'll have once you finally got it done has to be the payoff. I was going to ask you the one kind of psychological question. Do you think there are people, have you encountered such people, who find that even to address such an issue is sort of bad juju? It's sort of like jinxes you. And so I don't want to talk about it because then it will invite my demise in a
Oh,
weird sort of way. It's kind of in the back of their mind. Do you encounter that sort of mindset?
Yeah, that happens all the time. As we know, Prince didn't have a will or any kind of estate plan, and we saw how
right.
that played out in the media. So there is even somebody who had access to good planners probably had maybe I don't know what the reason was, but maybe there was that sort of psychological thing. I don't want to talk about it. It's an unpleasant subject. I have whatever issues around it. But yeah, death is not an easy thing to think about. And so when thinking about your estate plan, it's more about how you want to take care of those that you're leaving behind and how you kind of want to simplify their life when it comes to that point. So the way we kind of started our conversation here today about you don't do this for yourself, you do this for those loved ones that you're leaving behind.
What happens if they
The
don't?
program is going to die in about 2 minutes. So in those final 2 minutes, do you have questions you want to ask or any final comments, Dana? I'll just open it up to everybody.
I just asked, what happens if somebody doesn't have a will at all? I mean, what happens then?
Well, you're still going to go through the probate process,
Okay.
but your assets will be distributed by what's called intestate law. So it's a, old word, but basically it just means the state of Minnesota or whatever state you live in has a plan for your assets. And usually if you're married, everything goes to your spouse. If you're not married, then it goes to your kids. If you don't have kids or a spouse, then it goes to your parents. It's, it's really, really simple. It's never going to go to your favorite charitable organizations. That's not going to happen. And so it just may not happen the way you want it. So even if you don't have a plan, the state has a plan for you, even whether you like it or not.
Very good.
Any final questions in our last minute?
I was just going to add that in order to avoid post-demise arguments amongst family and things about sentimental things, I'm less interested in my possessions and my good jewelry than I was a decade ago. So I'm in the process of spending time with grandkids one-on-one, one at a time, and giving them those.
And so, Dana, thank you so much for being on the program. You want to hold up your book?
Oh, sure. It's kind of ancillary to our conversation today, but I did publish a book last year, Turning Wealth into What Matters, and it's really designed for charities. It's a step-by-step guide for charities to allow them to accept more complex gifts like real estate, retirement accounts, and things like that. So it's actually a guidebook with a lot of good resources. So if any of you are working for organizations or volunteer for charitable organizations, something to check out to really expand fundraising possibilities.
Okay, well, Candy, Nadia, Rashida, and Dana, thanks for being on the program today. We hope you will join us next month for another edition of Generations.